A reminder that there are handouts on the communion table if you didn't get one, and don't grab one of those that has 2 and 3 and 4 pages. This is just 1 page. Saving the planet, 1 step at a time. The front is the narrative, on the back is a little map to give you a guide of this journey that we're going to spend some time talking about. I don't know how much time we'll have. Initially, this was planned to be 2 lessons, and then plans changed. Now it's 1 lesson, so it's going to be somewhat condensed. One thing we learn in this lesson, kind of a surface thing we learn in this lesson, not part of the deeper meeting, which we'll come to and spend plenty of time on. But a surface lesson we learn is that, as William Barclay once said, the Apostle Paul was not one of those people who are so heavenly minded that they were of no earthly use. We come to see Paul in somewhat of a different role, in one sense, in this journey to Rome. He starts out, of course, as a prisoner. Well, he remains a prisoner, but he's loaded on this ship as a prisoner to be taken from Caesarea to Rome, where he had requested to go and have his trial. He had been treated abysmally and put off and all sorts of things by Felix and Festus and Agrippa, but now he was getting his opportunity as a Roman citizen to go to Rome. And we'll see during this voyage that he was definitely not so heavenly minded that he was of no earthly use. The trip itself, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200, 1,300 miles thereabouts, across the Mediterranean, as you can look on your map and see, going from right to left. But it was a trip that in good weather, good sailing weather in the Mediterranean this time, probably would have taken maybe 6 to 8 weeks. Instead, it's going to take somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 months for him to get there. Again, I want to first and foremost explain the handout, because almost none of it is my own, and I want to give credit where credit is due. And there's a fellow that's sitting in here today for class that I told ahead of time I was going to give him all the credit, or if it didn't work out well, all the blame. And that's David Roper, because almost all of this comes from his pen on this front sheet, with the exception of the verse from the hymn at the bottom. But I wanted to put this down because I thought he did such a splendid job, at least for me, in providing an outline, if you will, for taking what you might read as a very exciting, exhilarating, dramatic story that provides somewhat of a travelogue of different towns along the Mediterranean coast and some islands. But he brings out of that, to me, Brother Roper does, some practical things, very practical things that I might have otherwise missed, and I think would have missed, and I really appreciated the way he did it. And that's what you see there towards the bottom, in bold. We're all going to have, or have had, different kinds of storms. Some of them, of course, being from Oklahoma, are the real kind of natural storms. And seriously, we go through storms that have to do with health. We go through with storms that have to do with financial things. We go through storms that have to do with relationships. We go through emotional storms as well, for example, in the loss of a loved one. I thought a lot about Raylene and Amanda in thinking about this lesson and the application that Brother Roper had laid out. How do we handle those storms? I've often been around people, I think you've probably been around people, or you've thought it yourself. I don't know how people can deal with the storms of life, whether that be a death of a loved one or their own health issues or the breaking up of a relationship. I don't know how they can deal with that and not without God in their life. You've all heard that. Well, of course, that's what this is all about. This is God being involved in the plan that God wanted carried out and making it happen. Here are the 5 things that are in the commentary that Brother Roper penned. First one is expect the possibility of a storm. Now, I'm sure he didn't mean by that, don't always be a negative Nancy. Don't be a kind of person that sees the glass always half empty. But you got to be realistic. You've got to understand that, God sent rain, which in that context was a good thing. God sent rain for those plants upon the good and upon who else? The bad, the evil. We've all heard it. Why do such bad things happen to good people? And yes, that does happen. Some very bad things happen to good people. But some very bad things happen to bad people. And some wonderful things happen to good people and to bad people. It's there for all of us. We have to be realistic. And I think Paul could certainly be realistic because when you look at the 11th chapter of 2 Corinthians, Paul outlines some of the things that had happened to him. My, oh my. What is it that Dale says typically up here each Sunday as we studied Acts? Paul was just a walking, talking scar. I mean, he had been imprisoned and beaten and been in 3 shipwrecks before this shipwreck. It's written about there in 2 Corinthians. So Paul knew from personal experience that every day wasn't a day filled with sunshine and roses. So you have to understand that there are going to be some tough times. There's going to be a storm. If you'll look with me, the first few verses of chapter 27 sets the voyage up, and they're taking a ship. These prisoners are put upon a ship, and they're going to go up the coast from Caesarea to actually find a ship that will be going to Rome. The ship they start out on is not, but it is going up the coast, hopping to various ports, and their first port that they land at is Sidon. And it's interesting here, we're introduced, of course, in the very first couple of verses to Julius, who was the person who was in command of the soldiers escorting these prisoners. We don't know how many prisoners there were. I tried to go online, as a matter of fact, to figure out how many sailors there were on a ship typically like this. And about the best I could figure was it could vary anywhere from 30 to 75 sailors. We don't know how many were in this regiment. He's a centurion, and by definition it means he's a commander of 100, but that doesn't necessarily mean there would have been 100. More than likely there weren't quite that many. And then that leaves the rest of them to be either prisoners or perhaps people who booked passage on the ship. And we don't really know the answer to that either, because that could happen as well. People could actually just put passages on these ships. And this was not part of the luxury liner system that we think about today, keep in mind. They're going to end up on a ship that's Egyptian in origin, out of Alexandria. It's a granary. It's a freighter that would take grain and ship it. And that's the ship they find at Myra. That's the next stop they make after Sidon. By the way, in Sidon, interestingly enough, Julius is very kind to Paul and allows him to go ashore and be treated. We're not exactly sure what might have been wrong, but he had some needs, and Julius was kind enough to let him go ashore and see his friends and receive care, as it says. And the language, the Greek that's used, that Luke uses, does make it appear to be that it is some type of medical attention, but we don't know any particulars. So that's something interesting, and it'll come back when we really get to the meat of the matter about how Julius treated Paul, and we can wonder why. I think he was probably under orders to be very kind when he could, go out of his way to be good to Paul. Because Paul had put the governors and the leaders he had dealt with earlier in a very precarious political situation, not knowingly, but he had. They had been embarrassed to find out he was a Roman citizen, and so they wanted him treated pretty well. They didn't want anything happening to him untoward as he was transported to Rome. But I think later on, as we see how Julius the centurion treats Paul, it becomes more than that. It becomes more than that. Well, look at let's start with verse 8. This is the first time we see some... verse 7. Verse 7. This is the first time we really see some problems with the voyage. They're encountering some weather problems. But keep in mind, too, this is the first century, around 59, AD 59, well before the advent of the compass or the sextant. And so in sailing, you use what you can, what God has provided through nature. That is the stars, and the sun, and then the wind, and then the muscle of the oarsmen that are down there in the galley, manning those oars. We'll see how important that becomes a little later and puts into context what we're being told. We sailed slowly for many days, this is verse 7, and with great difficulty came opposite Nidus because the wind would not allow us to get there. So they're starting to encounter some issues with the wind. They left Caesarea probably either the very end of August or the very, very first part of September. They were still within the window of decent weather, not great weather, and they were pushing it. They'd have to have a lot of good fortune weather-wise to get to Rome in the 6 to 7 weeks that it should have taken. Because once you get to November, back in those days, most folks didn't even attempt sailing in the Mediterranean November through March, or at least through February, because of the winds and the weather. And so here they say the wind wouldn't allow them to get there, so we sailed under the shelter of Crete, opposite Salmon. With difficulty, we were moving along the coast and arrived at Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. This would mean they've probably been out and about in this boat now from the time they left Caesarea, by this time for about 5 or 6 weeks. So it has taken them as long to get from Caesarea to Fair Havens there on the Isle of Crete as almost as long as it might have taken a vessel with good winds to get to Rome. After much time had elapsed and sailing had become dangerous, and then in parentheses it adds, the fast had already passed. And this means the Fast of Atonement, which in this particular year, we can pinpoint in AD 59, was held on October the 5th. And so we're into past the first week of October somewhere. So going backwards, that's how you can figure they probably left Caesarea first part of September. And listen to what Paul says to them. Again, they're entering a very dangerous time to travel since they're now into the first week, second week of October. Paul advised, verse 10, saying to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will result in extensive damage and loss, not only of the cargo, but also of the ship and our lives." He gives them a warning to expect a storm. So this is a very real, concrete example of somebody understanding that they needed to expect a storm. Be ready. And he gives the warning to them about this storm. Now, this is based upon Paul's experience, based upon the weather conditions at this time of year, and there's no indication that this was a spiritual thought that he's passing on. We'll get to that later. This is Paul's opinion. He believes, he perceives, as he puts it. Interestingly enough, verse 11, I talked about how Julius, the centurion, had been kind to Paul already, would be very kind to him later. But it says, however, the centurion was persuaded more by the captain and the owner of the ship than by Paul. And he makes the mistake of siding with them, and they say, we're going to continue on. Instead of staying there, they wanted to reach Phoenix, not Arizona. It's a port there in Crete. And when a south wind blew gently, verse 13, they thought they had achieved their purpose. And they lifted anchor and coasted along as close as possible to Crete. And then it happens, verse 14. After a little time, a typhoon called the Northeaster swept down. Some of your translations may have Euraquilo, which is an alliteration of the word Northeaster. And the ship was caught and could not head into the wind. We gave way and were driven. So on your map, you see there just to the south of the island of Crete, you see Lasea. That's where they go out a little bit, and then suddenly they start moving to the west, and they're just being driven west by the winds. They're at the mercy of the winds. Verse 18, as a matter of fact, says they were, while they were being tossed violently by the storm, they were throwing things overboard. And neither the sun nor the stars were seen for many days, they say. So think about it. Again, you are navigating in those days by the sun during the day and the stars at night, and you no longer have that. It's too cloudy during the day and it's dark as pitch at night and cloudy. Added to that, you've got a wind that is against you, doing just the opposite of what you need it to do. Verse 21, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood among them and said, and here we get to the second bullet point of that list about things that will help us during a storm, expressing the promises of God. Men, indeed, you should have listened to me and not sailed from Crete to avoid this damage and loss. And that lead-in might sound to some like, I told you so, but I don't think that's what Paul intended. It was just him introducing the important thought he was going to pass along to them. Verse 22, but now I urge you to take courage. There will be no loss of life among you, only of the ship. For this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and God has given you all those sailing with you. Men, take courage, for I trust God that it will be just as it was told me. But we must run aground on a certain island. Now, by this time, they had been in this boat together for somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 9 weeks, a couple of months. And we're probably towards the end of October, maybe the first part of November. They've been out there doing really without food. They're doing everything they can think of to get this boat righted in the right direction and save it and not have a wreck, be lost out in the middle of the ocean. They have no real navigational means at their disposal. They're in bad shape. They're in rough shape. Now, again, we don't know how the passengers are broken down, categorized by prisoners, sailors, soldiers, passengers. But we will learn in a moment how many there were, and you've read it, so I'm not going to keep you in suspense. Of course, it's 276. I find it fascinating about God's Word. Sometimes there are those things that you really wonder about that aren't fleshed out for you, and you're left kind of a wonder. You know, God chooses to let you know what you need to know, but maybe not the detail that we might want to see. And then other times where he could have said there were a couple of hundred people on the ship, or there were not a lot of people on the ship. We're actually 276 people on the ship. It's exactly the number. In any event, that's neither here nor there. Expressing the promises of God so the storm doesn't overtake you unprepared. You got to be prepared, and when you are prepared, you will express the promises of God. And what did God say to him? Don't be afraid. Take courage. You're not going to die. The folks with you are not going to die because I've got a plan. And I'm going to see that that plan is carried out. And that's what he tells the shipmates he's with. Verse 30, the sailors were seeking to escape, and they lowered the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense they were going to lay out anchors from the bow. And here's where Paul exhibits the presence of God. Paul warned the centurion and the soldiers, unless the sailors stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Now, why would he say that? What was so important about the sailors staying in the ship? Because God's plan was for everybody to be saved. And isn't that God's plan, that everybody be saved? That's what he wants. And as Paul had said earlier, when he was relaying the message he had received from God through the angel, men, take courage, for I trust God that it will be as it was told me. He believed it. He expressed it. And now he was exhibiting that belief. As he said to the centurion and the soldiers, these sailors need to stay on this ship if you want to be saved. The soldiers, thankfully, believed Paul. And they cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and they let it fall away. And then it says, while day was dawning, Paul encouraged everyone to receive food, saying, and this begins verses 33 through 35, which to me covers the next bullet point of expediting God's plan. The word expedite can mean with dispatch, with haste, to make things happen even more quickly than they might ordinarily. But to help God's plan alone, sometimes you have to be working with God, but doing so actively. And again, this comes into what I said earlier, that Barclay had described Paul as being a person that wasn't so heavenly minded that he was of no earthly use. We can't expect just to sit back. Sometimes we have to do what God wants us to do. There are certain things he wants us to do. While day was dawning, Paul encouraged everyone to receive food, saying, "This is the 14th day you have been keeping watch and have not eaten." So for 2 weeks, just grabbing whatever they might, they really haven't had a meal. "I beg you to eat. This is for your health. Not a hair of your head will be lost." He once again wants to reinforce to them that they are going to be saved. They need to eat and get their strength up. He wants to help them. And the first thing he's going to do is to help their physical body. Then he took bread. Well, then he does something for their spirit, by the way. He not only encourages them to eat, in fact, he says, "I beg you to eat. This is for your health. Not a hair of your head will be lost." This has to help them with their spirit. They must think, now this guy speaks as if he knows. So he's trying to encourage them physically. He's trying to encourage them mentally. And then he took bread, verse 35, thanked God before them all, broke it, and began to eat. In this way, he's encouraging now their soul. Takes care of their body, their mind, now their soul. Thanking God for what they have. And what's the very next verse say? Verse 36, all were encouraged and received food. That's the fifth bullet point, experiencing the peace of God so that the storm won't leave you without reward. They were all encouraged. Yeah.
If I may add,
Uh-huh.
as a sailor who was in the Navy, and about the seas off the coast of the North Atlantic cruise, I think just to kind of sanitize this, the fact that they're in a storm, going to be shipwrecked, the fact that he even told them to take food, which is kind of laughable in a sense, because we had everything battened down, everything tied down. There wasn't nobody above decks personnel that needed to be there. And I'm sure he's screaming and shouting on it. I'm sure he's not sitting here real quiet like we are in class telling them, hey, not a hair on your head. So there's some intense drama going on in this.
Well, as we're going to see in a moment, notwithstanding Paul trying to help them both mind, spirit, body, it doesn't take exactly. We're going to get to that. You're absolutely right. There was a lot of chaos going on and continued to go on. Look at verse 39. Let's look at verse 38 and then we'll read from there. After they were satisfied, that is, after they had eaten, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Now they're getting serious. That's money going overboard. When the day came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay that had a beach. On it, they decided, if possible, to run the ship aground. So they finally see some land. It has a beach. And the plan is to dock there. They cut away the anchors, letting them stay in the sea. At the same time, they loosened the ropes of the rudders, hoisted the foresail into the wind, and headed for the beach. Well, they fell into cross currents and ran the ship aground. The bow stuck fast, and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken by the violence of the waves. So the front end is stuck, the tail end is being buffeted by the waves and is breaking into pieces. Verse 42, interesting. The soldiers advised that the prisoners be killed, lest some swim away and escape. Now, for context, we got to think about what the soldiers' fate would be to return without their prisoners, to arrive at their destination without their prisoners, with their prisoners having escaped. Could have been kind of dire for them. They might have paid the price that the prisoners were to pay. Okay? So they were thinking, I better make sure these prisoners don't swim away and survive. So they're thinking of themselves, thinking about their future. Verse 43, but the centurion wanted to save Paul. I think we've come to the point where we can say the centurion, Julius the centurion in this, sees Paul as more than, I better make sure this guy gets there alive or I'll be in trouble with my bosses. I think he truly has come to have an affection for Paul. Now, it doesn't tell us that, so take it for what it's worth, but that's my impression, that he has come to see Paul as someone special. At least that's what I like to think. You know, again, Paul was a prisoner, became a passenger in all this turmoil and chaos, and ultimately kind of became the captain. In essence, he was the first mate to God, who was really the captain. The centurion wanted to save Paul. He prohibited their plan, and that took quite a bit of courage. I don't know how many soldiers were there under his command, but my guess is there were more than just one other soldier, because it's plural. And so he stood up to them and prohibited them doing it, and ordered all who could swim to jump overboard and get to the land first, to be followed by the rest, those that could not swim or were unable to swim, some on planks and some on things from the ship. The last sentence, in this way, all escaped to the land, some by swimming themselves and some by using pieces of the craft as life preservers. And all escaped to the land. 276 souls on this boat. And God's plan from the get-go was for Paul to get to Rome and stand before the Caesar and have his trial there. God's hand is in all of this. And it's just so thought-provoking about the things that happened that made this plan work. But these 5 bullet points can help us just as they helped Paul and those people on that voyage, that ill-fated voyage. Expecting the possibility that there will be a storm, expressing the promises of God to help you be prepared for that storm, exhibiting the presence of God in our lives. In other words, expressing the promises of God is talking the talk, and exhibiting the presence of God in our lives is walking the walk. Expediting God's plan is being obedient, doing the things that need to be done, and not putting them off, not sitting back and waiting for somebody else to do them. Finally, with all of that, experiencing the peace of God, the reward you have that's difficult for us to describe, sometimes even difficult for us to fully understand. I got to go, if you want to turn to Genesis, the very first chapter. Verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Very familiar verse. Verse 2, the earth was shapeless and empty, And then the second half of that verse, verse 2. Darkness covered the roaring oceans, and God's Spirit was hovering above the waters. I think that's an apt description not only of the beginning of creation, but it's an apt description really of what happened in this voyage from Caesarea to Rome with Paul and his shipmates. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father God, we thank you so much for your word. And we pray, Father, that not only will we be in your word to learn facts, but to better understand you and your will for us so that we can be kind to people, be loving to people, and bring people to you. Father, again, forgive us when we fail you. And with every breath that you give us, may we try our best to be more and more like your Son Jesus